Chapter 12. I have a bad habit of trying to carry too many things at once. It almost got me fired my first day on the job at the Piccadilly cafeteria when I stacked too many dessert plates in the plastic bins so that a giant blob of blueberry pie and chocolate pudding leftovers teetered on top of the last saucer. The saucer flipped over and spilled the mess into some old lady's lap, and it turned out to be my manager's mother. So today I was trying to be fast and efficient, but careful not to spill. I kept my eye on the clock. If I could clear the lunch tables from the lunch rush fast enough, I could get a head start on the dishwashing, which would put me out of there with a full 20 minutes to spare to make it to the league headquarters. Maybe I'd even be early. I'd vowed never to be late again, that's for sure. The one and only time I showed up late for my league probationary training, I was called in for a one-on-one sit-down with the heavy hitters. "They're waiting for you," Golden Boy said, looking down at his watch. "Sorry I'm late, Just go. You've already kept them waiting long enough." Golden Boy swept me through the door. I wanted to smack that smirk right off Scarlett's face as I passed by her. Inside, I discovered it was worse than I'd expected. It was the whole league. All of them. Seated on the dais. A tribunal staring at me. I swallowed. This was it. I was going to be let go. I should have known better than to keep 2 jobs on top of my training, but we needed the money. I didn't want to make excuses. I thought about my father, and I decided to stand my ground. "Have a seat," Justice said from his lofty position. I could feel their eyes bearing down on me. I thought I even heard Warrior Woman growl. I closed my eyes and cleared my throat, ready for the worst. When I looked up, Silver Bullet was standing right in front of me. "Hold out your hand," he said. His face betrayed no emotion. What was this? Were they going to whack my knuckles with a ruler? I tentatively held out my hand, scanned the eyes of the league on the dais in front of me. Silver Bullet slipped a ring on my finger. "Congratulations," Justice said. A few smiles crept over their faces. "Your league probationary ring." I stared down at the ring. I couldn't believe it was on my finger. "This is an outward symbol of an inner belief, a reminder that wherever you go, you're part of a team." Justice hovered closer to me. "It also serves as a tracking device, if you're ever in trouble and you need help." He floated directly in front of me, slightly above my eye line, and then descended to my level. And most important, he shook my hand, it has the league emergency signal. The next day, I dropped the ring in the sink at work and thought for sure I'd lost it. I'd searched everywhere, even unscrewed the pipes, but nothing. Before I went into a full panic, I heard a funny noise from the Hobart dishwasher. I just put a load in, and something sounded loose in the machine, like a piece of dish had chipped off. I heaved open the door to the industrial-sized machine and pulled out the trays of plates and mugs, and there in a coffee cup was my ring. I glanced over my shoulder to make sure no one could see me, and I slipped the ring back on my finger. Still hot from the wash cycle, it burned my skin, but I didn't care. It actually felt good. I hoped that it burned a place onto my finger so it would never fall off again. Since today I was in a hurry, I contemplated stacking one more dinner plate on top of my dishes in my bin, but decided against it. One more sweep in the dining room, I could get started loading my dishes and be out of there by... Hello? My heart did a somersault. Goran sat in a booth, his little brother across from him, picking at a piece of cornbread with his fork. He wore his security guard uniform, which made his shoulders look even broader. I looked for bags under his eyes from working the late shift, but I couldn't find any. Even in the dismal lighting of the Piccadilly cafeteria, his dark eyes lit up the room. Then he smiled at me again. I opened my mouth and somehow managed to say, "Hi." "Tom," my shift manager pulled me aside by the arm, and I almost dropped all my dishes. "I need you to stay late. Manny went home sick." Trying to hide my disappointment, I wiped the sweat off my forehead. I looked over at Goran, who pretended not to look at me as my boss ordered me around. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw his little brother snickering at me. "Look, just finish Manny's dishes and you can go, okay?" "Okay," I said, and hurried into the kitchen with my tray. I loaded that Hobart faster than any human ever had before, Manny's dishes too. I noticed my reflection in the sink full of rinse water and saw that when I'd wiped the sweat off my brow, I'd accidentally smeared whipped cream from a chocolate pudding all over it. That must have been what Goran's little brother was laughing at. I didn't have time to feel the embarrassment. I scrubbed off the mess with the corner of my apron and studied the tall stack of pots and pans that still needed to be washed. How was I ever going to get out of there on time? "Someone's looking for you out front," my manager called out to me. "Says he has a tip for the busboy." I dropped my shoulders. I didn't have time for this. Plus, I was a total mess, and I really didn't like the thought of Goran giving me some token tip because I looked so pathetic at work. It was patronizing and it made me mad. Who did he think he was anyway? I stopped short of the register, surprised because my father had never come to see me at work before. "Hey, kiddo." "I'm kind of busy, Dad." I glanced down at my watch. I'm trying to get out of here." Irma, behind the register, rang up Dad's to-go meal. This was totally unlike him. He'd never spent money on lunch. He prepared a brown paper bag every day, which he ate alone in the factory cafeteria. What was he doing here? Was he just checking up on me? Just wanted to give my favorite busboy a tip. Dad pulled a 20 out of his pocket to pay Irma. He handed her the money first, then took the bag with his good hand. I cleared empty serving trays from under the sneeze guards and stacked them in my arms. I spotted Goran and his little brother looking over the dessert station. Goran paid careful attention to his brother's selection, but I could tell he was eyeing me with his peripheral vision. Suddenly, I didn't like the thought of him and my father being in the same room, especially with me in it. I took more pans and added them to the pile, which was growing too big for me to carry. I hoped that if the stack grew above my head, no one would be able to see me. I was thinking about taking a night off to come and see one of your games, Dad said in a fixed stare. No, that's okay. I almost dropped the pans. It's just Summer League. I felt my ring catch in the handle of the Salisbury steak pan, and it almost yanked my finger out of joint. Dad looked at the floor. Irma offered him his change, and the line behind him waited impatiently for him to take it. His mind was on something else, because he reached out for the change with his bad hand. From behind the stack of trays, I saw the shocked faces in line when they spotted the melted clump of flesh that used to be Dad's hand. I saw Goran pretend not to notice. His little brother's jaw was open. Goran quickly grabbed the kid's hand and pulled him in for a private conference. He wouldn't make eye contact with me. All of a sudden, a charge took hold of my body, a shock that only I could feel. It took me by surprise, and I almost dropped every tray in my arms. It was the alarm on the League probationary ring vibrating, the emergency signal. My heart sank. I had to answer it, but I couldn't let my dad catch on. Dad, I've really got to go. I hope he wouldn't notice the strain on my face, the vibrations emanating from my ring. Dad studied me for a second, saw the dishes teetering in my arms. He gave me the once-over, and I did my best to slip my arms underneath the stack so he wouldn't notice the ring. Then he steeled himself against the usual reactions, whispers, harsh looks from the people behind him, set his lunch down, and took the change from Irma with his good hand. He leaned over the counter and shoved a $10 bill in my shirt pocket. See you at home. As he walked out, Dad passed by Goran, who had finished talking with his little brother. Both of them were trying their best not to look at him as he passed. Dad noticed Goran, stopped for a second, then suddenly whipped his head around to look back at me. I looked down, hoping he hadn't caught me watching, hoping he hadn't realized that I couldn't bear the thought of Goran and my father sharing the same space, breathing the same air, existing that close to one another. Dad turned and left, and I struggled to keep the stack of trays from falling as I carried them back into the kitchen. I dropped the trays into the sudsy water and leaned against the sink for just a second to catch my breath, utterly spent, exhausted. Then I ran out of there as fast as I could to answer the alarm. The crisis turned out to be a big disaster, where Golden Boy and Typhoid Larry had already confined the situation to a manageable space. You're late, Golden Boy chastised me. I'm sorry, You'll have to do better than that next time if you get a next time. Isn't that? I thought I recognized the men on the docks. The wrecking balls. Ruth finished my sentence and studied them with concern. She stamped out her cigarette with extra oomph. I'd seen them in the news before. Local, not prime time. They were really nothing more than retired professional wrestlers who couldn't come up with a reasonable occupation that paid as well. Their biggest problem seemed to be their lack of finesse. They'd hold up a bank or a drugstore by bulldozing their way through. If they just used their noggins even a little, they could have been untouchable. A few of them actually did have super strength and limited invincibility. It was almost as if they'd rather get caught than execute a clean getaway, if it meant they'd get back on camera. The problem was they'd had a tendency to cause a lot of damage in their wake, and bystanders had a way of getting caught in the crossfire. In this case, the wrecking balls had decided to hold up a bank where Typhoid Larry happened to be cashing his paycheck. Larry raced over, breathless, and told us what had happened. He had the good sense to give the balls a wicked dose of hives in the lobby of the bank, and this had stopped the robbery in mid-progress, but he'd left all his cash back at the counter. Don't worry, Ruth said, touching her fingers to her temples to make it seem more dramatic. The money's still there. How many of the guys do we have to worry about? I don't know, 6, maybe 7? I took one out over there by the crane, gave him acute emphysema. Larry put his hands on his knees to catch his breath. I think I went a little overboard. Can I borrow your inhaler? I don't want him to die or anything. Ruth fished around in her pocketbook and forked over her asthma inhaler. Don't use it all up. Medicaid only gives me one a month. She snapped her purse shut. Larry took off back to the fight, and I watched Golden Boy weave in and out of the melee. He'd been smart to move the fight over to the docks, where the chances of hurting anyone were kept to a minimum. There seemed to be 7 of the balls, but it was hard to tell since they all looked similar. Long, shaggy hair, big steroidy bodies, and skin-tight, spangled wrestling skivvies. I don't know how they managed to walk in public in those outfits, much less try to rob a bank. Golden Boy held up his hand like a point guard calling a play and flashed the single for the fastball special. We'd practiced it over and over in the league's STA, but it was the first time we tried it in the field. The idea was that while Miss Scarlet distracted our enemies with blinding flash of light, Larry would work up a really good illness, whereupon Golden Boy would pick him up and carry him with super speed to infect each of our dazed enemies. Ruth would be on hand to predict which ones to infect first, and that would be our best chance of success before Scarlet's dazzling effects wore off. According to the rest of the plan, Ruth would then predict where Golden Boy would end up and tell me where to stand to grab hold of him immediately to heal away the sickly side effects of carrying Typhoid Larry at his most infectious. I'd never liked this plan, primarily because there wasn't much for me to do. My power wasn't really an offensive weapon, so I understood my part, but I wanted a taste of the action, and I resented Golden Boy for not dialing me in. How was I supposed to prove myself if I didn't get to do anything? Still, if nothing else, I was a team player, so when Ruth directed me to post up at the other end of the dock near the back entrance to the local hospital, I obeyed. I sighed and waited for Miss Scarlet to kick into high gear. She loved giving a good show, and this was no exception. On Golden Boy's countdown, she took off into the air like a rocket, exploding into a one-woman 4th of July fireworks display. When she whizzed through the air past each of the wrecking balls, cutting it awfully close to their faces. If they hadn't been so tough-skinned, I'm sure she would have burned their noses to a crisp. Suckers! She shouted as she flew past them, setting off potent bursts of light. At the end of the line, she pulled up into the air and stung the last and fattest one in the ass with a tiny radiation blast for good measure. I saw her lips mouth 2 words as she did it. Lard ass. Ruth conferred with Golden Boy, and then she pointed out the best path for him to run, starting with the fattest guy and ending with the hulking, ripped blonde guy who was rubbing his eyes not so far away from me. Larry cleared his throat vigorously, working up an especially viscous phlegm. Before he could cough anything up, Golden Boy grabbed him in his arms and they were off. I was restless to get on the action, but I understood my job was to wait, so that's what I did. Soon the first 3 wrecking balls were on their knees, doubled over in pain, gripping their stomachs from Larry's power. The youngest one was actually kind of cute. Kind of like a beefier, tackier version of Uberman. How he'd end up with these losers. What in his life made him take this turn to wear gaudy tights, take steroids, and rob banks? Maybe he just needed better opportunities. Maybe he just needed someone who believed in him. Suddenly I spotted Ruth hurrying toward me, waving her hands frantically. She stopped short. "Uh-oh," she said. "Uh-oh, what?" I asked. "Woomph." The 7 wrestler, the blonde one, knocked me over on my back. The next thing I knew, he had me pinned to the pavement, his ham-hock knees pressed painfully onto my arms as he sat with his full weight on my chest. I struggled to catch my breath, and I could see out of the corner of my eye that Golden Boy and Larry had finished their run. Larry collapsed, drained from exerting so much energy. Golden Boy looked around anxiously for me, his neck craning in all directions at super speed. His face started to twitch and panic was setting in. I was nowhere to be found. He dropped to the ground on all 4s like a dog, grabbing his stomach and began heaving out his guts. This wasn't good. I'd failed to do my part, and now there were 3 of us down. That left only Ruth and Scarlet to take on the rest of the wrecking balls. It was basically all my fault. Get up! Get up! Golden Boy's down! I heard Miss Scarlet screaming at me. I looked up, searching for something to grab hold of, but all I could see was the big blonde wrestler's crotch bearing me down in a sweaty, spangled jockstrap. That meathead's hands wrapped around my neck and he began to choke me. I kicked my feet up and tried to call out for help, but I couldn't even catch my breath. "Aim for his nads," Ruth screamed. "Aim for his nads with what? A strong sense of integrity?" Then suddenly we were airborne. Scarlet hit us at full speed and lifted us off the ground. "Drop him," she screamed at the meatloaf, "or I'll fry your balls off." She shot a flame to underscore her point. So he dropped me. It was a long way down. I crashed through the sunroof of the children's burn unit in the hospital. Fortune smiled upon me. A giant Pink Panther stuffed animal broke my fall when I landed on it. A little girl with half her face melted off looked up from her coloring book and yelped. "Who are you?" I could see excitement in the expressive half of her face. "I'm Tom," I said. "Sorry to make such a mess. Watch out for the broken glass." Are you a hero?" she asked. I looked around at the room full of children, most of them covered head to toe in scars, melted kids in shorty pajamas playing with building blocks and crayons and construction paper. They stared at me with awe, like I dropped in on their rehab unit from a cloud. I hope so. I rushed over to the window to look at the fight on the docks below. The orderly and nurses had rushed in by now, and they were gathered with all the patients watching the battle. Golden Boy and Larry, still helpless because I hadn't been there to heal them, were getting pummeled by 4 of the chunky dudes in tights. Scarlet held them off with a couple of her heat rays, but she couldn't take on the whole group by herself. Even from far away, you could hear her mouthing off. One of the kids asked a nurse what Miss Scarlet was saying, and I saw the nurse blush. Ruth, strangely, was pointing her finger at the oldest, fattest wrecking ball. It looked like the two of them were engaged in a heated debate. She poked her finger into the 2 mounds of his chest, and they were screaming in each other's faces. I looked down at my boots and studied my shoelaces. Man, I'd really screwed up this time. The damage alone was going to cost more money than I can imagine, and here we were getting our asses kicked by a bunch of middle-aged guys in body lycra. I wanted the soft red carpet of the playroom to swallow me alive so I wouldn't have to look anyone in the eye ever again. 2 of the wrecking balls hoisted a crane into the air and aimed for Golden Boy and Larry. From the hospital, we could all watch helplessly at what was coming. Neither of the heroes would be able to dodge it if they ever even saw it. I wanted to yell out a warning, but I couldn't breathe. One of the nurses screamed as the wrecking balls let the crane fly. In a flash of fire and brimstone, Miss Scarlet yanked Golden Boy and Larry away in the nick of time. The last-minute save threw off her balance, and she tumbled with them into the river. The water instantly extinguished her flame. Now the immediate threat was the 2-ton crane hurtling through the air directly at the hospital. The floor shook, and we heard a great kaboom outside as the crane crashed the emergency room entrance, leaving nothing but a crater in the parking lot. It was a miracle that no one had been standing there. The fear in the rehab room was palpable. The people by the window began to cry, some frozen, some screaming. The wrecking balls saw their opportunity to create mayhem had worked, and they weren't about to let up. The oldest ball pushed Ruth to the ground and motioned for his cronies to leap over the fence and join him at the adjoining construction site. They'd followed him, and each one picked up a heavy piece of machinery, a forklift here, a bulldozer there. They aimed it in our direction, straight at the hospital, ready to launch. Emergency sirens shrieked from all directions. Ambulances and police cars approached in the distance, but we all knew they'd be too late. A skinny nurse with a terrified face tapped me on the shoulder. "Excuse me," she pleaded. "Can't you help us?" In theory, I was supposed to help my team, but I was much safer in there with all the burned children and soft toys. Then I felt something softer than any stuffed animals touch my hand. I looked down and saw the little girl with half a good face. Her big brown eyes were filled with hope. My hands began to grow warm, and I could feel heat from the entire room swirling around my body. She smiled. "Your hand feels good," she said. Then a little boy limped over and grabbed her hand, and I felt a charge of fire course through my body. He reached over and held out his hand for another little girl in a wheelchair. Her bright green eyes peered through the thick bandages wrapped around her head, and she found his hand with her withered remains of her own. And one by one, the children in the unit linked up, drawn to each other's hands. Children calmly emerged from their rooms and wandered over in our direction, like they'd heard there was a cake in the playroom, irresistibly drawn to the heat pumping in and out of my own hands. I wanted to scream in agony each time another kid joined hands. The charge it sent through me was incredible, and I wanted to flail wildly on the ground. All I could feel were thousands of scorching flames licking at every inch of my body, my skin melting away cell by cell. My left big toe began to twitch. I knew in a second either the heat would overwhelm me or a seizure would. Both my hands were trembling now, and the nurses had noticed the unbreakable chain of melted kids attracted to me. They ran in all directions for security guards, a doctor, or anyone to pull us apart. My vision grew dim, the edges of my sight cloudy and dark. I could just make out the line of scarred children join hand to hand as it extended down the hall. Then my body went numb. I crossed a threshold, and the pain suddenly didn't bother me anymore. I only wanted one thing. I looked at the wrecking balls across the way, and I prayed they wouldn't throw the machinery at us. I prayed they'd just leave us alone and go away. I prayed that any great power anywhere in the universe would come down and stop them in any way possible. My eyes fluttered up into my head so far I thought I'd be able to see my brain, and then all of a sudden I felt an explosion somewhere deep inside me, like all my organs had burst with joy and anguish and happiness and pain, like I'd ripped all the ligaments in my body in half, and the pain was amplified to infinity. And that's all I remembered. "Well, it could have been worse," Larry said, and dabbed his leaky nose with a frayed tissue. Each of us fired looks at each other, Kevin at Scarlet, Ruth at Kevin, Scarlet at me at Ruth, then all of us at Larry with one question on our lips. How? Apparently, I'd knocked out the power a whole half-mile in diameter. Of course, the cameras and news crews carry their own power and recorded everything, and I do mean everything. From the wrecking ball's escape to Miss Scarlet's infamous slap, the one she gave local award-winning news reporter Bruce Barry from the Channel 4's Eyewitness News. Look, my jacket has unbuttoned and God knows what they could see. And there I was, passed out on the ground with a camera up in my face. Sorry, but he deserved it. Miss Scarlet fastened the top button of her delivery jacket. Is it cold in here? You left a second-degree burn on his cheek, Golden Boy said. So he can grow a beard, Scarlet said. He should have thought about that before he started poking around my privates. She pulled out a thin bottle of nail polish remover from her utility belt and dabbed a cotton ball with the liquid. The acrid smell filled the room and she rubbed the chipped paint off her nails. I don't know why you're on my case anyway. Tom's the one who screwed up. All eyes turned to me. No one understood how I was able to absorb all that hurt at once and incapacitate everyone around me with it. If I could have controlled the outburst and confined it to only the wrecking balls, it would have been a clean capture. Instead, I'd knocked everyone out and given some people seizures. Thank God I'd been in the hospital, because if the reporters had got my face on camera, Dad would have found out about my new extracurricular activities in an instant. I'd have to be more careful in the future. Maybe I needed a mask. If you can't stand the heat, Scarlet said to me, stay out of the steam room. She tossed a dirty red cotton ball over her shoulder and smeared her nails with a clean one. Let's try to keep this constructive, Golden Boy said. We all could have done better. Larry, what did you give them anyway? Diverticulitis. Larry bit the inside of his cheek. It can be very painful once it sets in. Scarlet rolled her eyes. Once it sets in isn't really good enough in a fight scenario, Golden Boy said. They gave us a good thrashing. Hey, if Tom had been where he was supposed to be, Larry held up his hands innocent, and he was right. For all the minor contingencies that occur in a fight, after months of training, I knew better than to let my guard down and abandon my post no matter what the circumstance. I should have been there to help them. Everyone looked at me again, and I didn't know what to say. I couldn't lie. Everyone had seen I wasn't where I was supposed to be. Well, Tom, we're now a full 200 points behind all the other tryout groups, Golden Boy read from the incident form. All of our faces, except yours, since you were conveniently out of the battle by that point, have been plastered all over the local news as losers who bungled their capture. Have anything to say for yourself? I'd been throwing up at regular intervals since the incident. I'd never used my powers that way, and I had what could only be described as the world's worst hangover from doing so. I really didn't want to have this conversation now, while I was still recovering from the rebound effect of my powers. I belched and held my lips together and fought off the urge to barf. To add insult to injury, we were the laughingstock of the league, and it was all my fault. What do you say? Out of the blue, Ruth blew her rape whistle, loud. I could hear Silver Fox and Sonic Ear howl in pain 3 whole floors above us. Maybe you all didn't notice, but when the hospital was about to crumble with all those innocent people inside, Tom was the only one who stopped the wrecking balls. The only finger I'd like to point right now is the middle one at all of you, bunch of ungrateful wretches, if you ask me. Ruth struck a match in the bottom of her heel and lit her cigarette. Now, maybe he doesn't fully know how to use his powers yet, sure. Maybe he should have found a way to stop them without blacking out half the city, without sending everyone into convulsions. But the point is, all of those people lived because he stopped the wrecking balls. So let's suck it up and give a little credit where it's due. I mean, diverticulitis. Seriously, Larry, what were you thinking? Why not give them a real bad case of dandruff? Scarlet, you dropped the kid 3 stories into a crowded hospital. You're lucky no one was killed. And Golden Boy, if you weren't so busy trying to be a one-man rescue machine, well, there may be no I in team, but apparently there's a real big one in Kevin. If you're so goddamn wary about our PR, then go get a job on Entertainment Tonight, because last time I checked, this gig was about helping people, not helping our image. By the way, all those kids in the burn ward have been making remarkable recoveries, up to 75% in some cases, nothing short of a miracle in my humble opinion. If you ask me, you're all just pissed off because you had to change into a new pair of pants once you woke up after the seizures. Welcome to my world. I have to do that every time I laugh real hard at a good episode of Jake and the Fat Man. Wow. That actually shut the rest of the group up, and I wanted to kiss Ruth right then and there. I didn't see you do anything either, Scarlet said under her breath. Ruth whipped around. What did you say to me? I said I didn't see you do much of anything either. Ruth exhaled cigarette smoke and a sly grin crept over her face. That's because I knew we'd win. After the meeting wrapped, Golden Boy offered Scarlet a fast ride to work. He said if he really turned it on, she'd make it to her shift in time. She thanked him without any hint of real gratitude, and when he scooped her up for the ride, she checked to make sure the buttons on her jacket were fastened tightly and warned him that if he copped any sort of cheap feel, she'd roast his ass. And then they were gone. I waited for Ruth by her car in the parking lot and looked at my watch. It was late, and Dad was going to ask about basketball. Summer League was almost over, so I was going to have to come up with a new excuse soon anyway. Ruth limped with a sore hip over to the door of her car and fumbled for the keys with crooked arthritic fingers. We got in and drove without a word for a long time. "Hey, Ruth," I said finally, "why were you arguing with that one guy, the old wrecking ball?" Ruth didn't take her eyes off the road. "I used to work with him." I thought about it for a second and it didn't make a lot of sense to me. "He used to be one of the good guys?" Ruth took a long drag on her cigarette. "No," she exhaled smoke through her nose. "He didn't used to be one of the good guys." "Oh, if he hadn't been one of the good guys, then she must have been. It was a long time ago and I don't want to talk about it." So we didn't. We didn't say another word the whole way home.